Afternoon and welcome. My name is Tamsin Russell and I work at the Museums Association, and it is my pleasure to be hosting today's session, Collecting the Pandemic. Before I hand over to our chair, Domenico, I want to go through a few housekeeping arrangements. First of all, as attendees to this session, your cameras and your microphones have been disabled. That doesn't mean that you can't continue to network or share information or make connections. We really would encourage you to use the chat function for those purposes. And we will be also posting some links from some of the speakers' talks as we go through. You can tweet your inspirations and your learning using the hashtag Museums2020. And I want to just highlight two inclusion functions that we have audio description, and if you require audio description, please look at the toolbar on your Zoom call and highlight and select interpretation. It's the icon that looks like a globe, and please select the French channel where you'll be listening to Andrew audio describe our speakers. We also have live closed captioning, so if you require live closed captioning, please select that at the bottom of the screen, and you have two options: either subtitles or full transcript, depending on the level of detail that you want to gain access to. You can leave the webinar at any time, and we are recording all of the webinars, so you're more than welcome then to catch up on those at a later date. We really would encourage you to engage as much as possible. So in addition to the chat function, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A function on the toolbar of your screen. Our chair will be fielding those questions at the end, so please keep them short, sharp and sweet so we can make the most of our time together. Finally, before I formally hand over, if there are any technical issues, please do bear with us and feel free to email me directly in the chat function and I'll see what I can do. Other than that, thank you so much. I will see you in about 55 minutes. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Tamsin, for being such a great host and such a good, well-organized conference. So, hello, everyone. My name is Domenico Sergi, and I am senior curator for a contemporary collecting program called Curating London. I hope everyone is well, given the circumstances, and that your level of Zoom fatigue has not yet reached the point of no return, because this is like the last day of the conference and the last afternoon of the conference. So I just want to thank, of course, the speakers and the Museum Association for hosting this panel. This session really explores how museums and heritage organizations around the world are responding to the pandemic. And this work is ongoing and extremely diverse in nature, as also reflected in the latest sort of special edition of the Museum and Society Journal. Whilst we can't enjoy the distance of history to help us unravel this time, museums' initial response to the pandemic can be a useful benchmark to reflect on fundamental questions concerning contemporary collecting and museum role in society more in general. So one few of the questions that we will be exploring together with the panelists are: what does it mean to rapidly respond, collect in a time of crisis? What ethical and practical issues should be considered, and how can collecting practice lay bare the structural inequalities mainstreamed by the pandemic, and how can this inform and change our understanding of the collections that we have of past pandemic? No doubt this is a very complex period for museums, so collecting the pandemic as it were fits in a wider set of important issues. The Black Lives Matter movement has accelerated the need to confront questions of white privilege, the colonization of practice, and ongoing legacies and effigies of empire. These discourses are powerfully impacting museums' work, generating particularly a huge amount of emotional labor for the workforce directly involved. Job security is also increasingly an issue for museum sector around the world. We're all experiencing or about to experience huge cuts in the sector. So this brings questions of self-care to the core of the context of the discussions. So as I was saying, today I've got the pleasure to be joined by three speakers across three different time zones, which I greatly thanks for their presence. I will introduce them in no particular order, and then we will start the presentations and take questions at the very end. So please do feel free to write your questions in the chat. I'll be looking at this, but we will bunch them up at the end of the sessions. So first we have Margriet Schavemaker. No doubt I've mispronounced your name, Margriet, as anticipated. This is Margriet is Artistic Director of the Amsterdam Museum and Professor of Media and Art in Museum Practice at the University of Amsterdam. We also are I'm very pleased to have Lindsay Turley, who is Vice President of the Museum and Collection and Museum of the City of New York. Thanks, Lindsay, for joining us. I also landed Lindsay from Georgia. So hopefully by the end of the session, we will know more about what happened in Georgia, election-wise. And also, last but not least, Ellie Miles, who is documentary curator at the London Transport Museum in London. So I will hand it over now to Ellie, who will be our first panelist to present.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me as part of this session. I thought what I do is, I hope that's working, is just kind of give you a run through of some of the work we've been doing at London Transport Museum over the last pandemic, I suppose. So London Transport Museum's focuses, as you might imagine, very much on the role of transport in London. So it's not as far-reaching in some ways as the Museum of London. And I'm working there as a documentary curator, which is an Arts Council England funded role, alongside a fantastic curator called Rosamund Lily West, who actually began at the museum in March and has done a terrific job on this project. So let's see if this works. So the first thing that I kind of wanted to mention was that in March, as it happened, we published the Contemporary Collecting Ethical Toolkit for Museum Practitioners. So this was something that we worked on with Rosamund's predecessor, Susanna Cordner, and Jane Kavanagh, who'd recently published another toolkit for contemporary collecting. So this was really kind of focused on some of the issues, and the idea was to kind of make us accountable and improve practice and shine a light on some really good work and resources across the sector to kind of turn some of those hidden processes inside out to make sure that they were shared. So this kind of addressed 5 issues that we thought were really important issues. These included issues of the idea about balance and the idea of should museums be presenting both sides, and what's the role of hate and hateful material and damaging material like that in questions of balance. There was another strand which was looking at how contemporary collecting can intersect with decolonisation and decolonising museums. A third strand of the work was about climate justice and contemporary collecting's role within and around that. There was another section about trauma and distress, which has been incredibly helpful to us this year. And finally, a section about digital preservation and the specific kind of processes and ethics connected with that. So this document was something we've been preparing, and we circulated in March. So it was a really useful thing, and it's available online. This is just an open access thing, and I think we'll share the link in the chat, hopefully, for anyone who's interested in learning more. There's some fantastic case studies in there. So LTM, we've really tried to centre our collecting around our key principles that we've kind of been looking at a lot over the last few months. And these are questions about sensitivity, about care, and about collaboration. So over the last few months, we've been working with the Contemporary Collecting Group, which is an informal collective, vaguely a network, just a group of people, support network asking each other for help sometimes. And also, as well as that, the network that Eleanor Carter has led which is about collecting the pandemic, which has also been incredibly useful. And I think the way those two groups have interacted and supported one another has been really interesting. So everything we've done has been very collaborative and very informed by practitioners across the sector, especially people working on the NHS at 70 project, people at the Postal Museum, Welcome, and so on. There's so many, it feels like a sea change in how we work, to be honest with you. So our approach breaks down into short, medium and long term. The short term, I think very familiar to lots of people, might be about responsive collecting as unprecedented events have unfolded. And I can say a little bit about more of that in a minute. The medium term, which we would kind of think about as kind of September this year onwards, which is hopefully about leading distinctive structured collecting projects with proper scope for participation and holding space for people to tell their own stories. And then long term, just being aware that this is an area which we'll be collecting for years to come, and where we can start to round out the story. So the short term responsive collecting is work that began in March. I was absolutely reeling when lockdown and pandemic was all announced. And if I'm very self-critical and honest, I think getting collecting projects underway was a way to make me feel like I was in control of something, and that I was, and so actually I don't think that's necessarily the best way to do a project, because that was much more about me as a practitioner than it was about the museum or the need for the work to happen more broadly. So a lot of that didn't happen, and I think that's quite good. Anyway, so we tried lockdown transport diaries. We developed a method, got it all signed off, and then realised I just couldn't send it to people. I just couldn't add to people's life, burden in life and what people were going through, especially transport workers at the time. So that was an interesting attempt that paused, and we have one transport diary. So that's interesting. We've revisited that method. There were things like shortlisting and reviewing public health information posters, and at first it felt very strange thinking about TfL, Transport for London, sharing posters and materials telling people not to travel after so many years of encouraging public transport use. Over the period, there have been a number of high-profile figures, so transport workers who've been, on the cover of Vogue and things like that for the first time, thinking about digital objects. And really, this process happened at a time when the museum, like lots of museums, was incredibly dysfunctional. Lots of our work was disrupted to the point where we weren't physically able to access. Personally, I wasn't in a great mental state. And lots of our procedures, policies and sign-off mechanisms just were prioritised elsewhere. And so that was an issue. Medium term, we're kind of trying to move into now more distinctive structured projects. So thinking about different topics and how we might address those. So I'll just run through some of these kind of interventions into the landscape to promote safer travel in terms of walking and cycling, the effect on station retail units. We relaunched the Diaries project in a slightly different way with our museum friends, looking in more detail at cleaners' experiences in pandemics, this and previous ones. What happens in terms of workplace violence for frontline transport workers and the use of body cameras to reflect that. And also something on the zip card campaign. Can you tell these slides were written last week, Londoners, because since the new TfL. So this was about free travel for under 18s, and that sort of hanging in the balance. But the campaigns that young people led kind of showed the importance of that mobility. And then long term, thinking about the virus, assuming at some point in spring next year, perhaps the worst effects may have passed. And at that point, we might begin to physically be able to gather materials safely. We hope to have much better structures in place for our interviewees with regards to access to counselling. We'll be training as mental health first aiders as well to help resource that. We imagine that there may be more information regarding a public inquiry and how we might, our collective might be affected by that. And again, this is a situation that's likely to last for a very long time. And just to be aware that this collecting will go on for decades. So that was the kind of things I wanted to share today. And then I think I'll pass over to Lindsay from the Museum of the City of New York to say a bit more.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And thank you, Dom, for inviting the Museum of the City of New York to join this conversation. I am just going to screen share here quickly as well. Bear with me. All right. So first off, I'd just like to provide a little background on the Museum of the City of New York. We were founded in 1923 and moved to our current and permanent home in the East Harlem neighborhood of Manhattan in 1934. We hold approximately 750,000 objects in our collection, dating back to the city's earliest days as a Dutch trading colony in the 17th century, all the way up to the present. These objects range in type, including manuscripts, ephemera, maps, paintings, sculptures, costumes, furniture, decorative arts, architectural elements, photographs, prints, and even vehicles. While the museum provides research access to our collections, we collect first and foremost to support our exhibitions, and we do not seek to create an encyclopedic collection, which is definitely something that we've had to consider while collecting around the current pandemic. The museum's open call to our community began in April, and it was initially launched through an Instagram engagement campaign, which solicited images documenting the experiences that New Yorkers and visitors to New York were having during the pandemic throughout the 5 boroughs, in their homes, on their streets, just going about their daily life. And we asked them to use the hashtag COVIDStoriesNYC. While we never intended to look at all of these submissions as potential accessions for our collection, our initial goal here was to create a means for interacting with our community and the public while we were closed. And through this campaign, we were sharing individuals' images out through our own digital channels. As the Museum of the City of New York, we felt a very strong commitment to document this situation in our city. You know, it's definitely one of the most challenging times I think all of us have been through in our lives. And as they came in, they were reviewed by our prints and photographs curator. He would flag the ones that he felt were the strongest. We'd reach out and seek permission from those who submitted them. And again, as I mentioned, shared back out via our digital channels. Following George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis and the surrounding resurgence in an already vital Black Lives movement, the museum heightened attention around a similar social media campaign that we already had corresponding to a gallery we have dedicated to activism in New York. So through that, we've received over 8,000 submissions at the last count, with images still coming in. We've also begun to review those images to nominate acquisitions for our permanent photography collection as well. We don't collect digital right now. We only collect physical objects. And so we'll be printing those images out and accessing them as physical prints for the collection. When we first launched that campaign, we simultaneously issued what I referred to as a soft ask. And we asked that individuals send descriptions and corresponding images of objects that they thought could tell the story of COVID in New York City, and asked them to email them to the museum. When we first put this out in April, we didn't really put a lot of outreach and attention behind it, because honestly, we weren't sure how we were going to physically start accepting objects at that point. Like everyone, we had very few staff on site. I was going in about once a week just to check on the environment and make sure everything was safe. But the idea of actually trying to arrange for shipments and receive objects was well beyond what our staffing model could handle at that point. We were also still awaiting guidance on how concerned we needed to be about the transmission of the virus through surfaces. And the last thing we wanted to do was bring the virus into the museum and get our staff ill. So once the New York State governor issued a plan for physically returning to work, we reissued our open call for objects in what we now call our community collecting initiative. This happened with July, and we followed up with much more attention and outreach. This open call also included specific collecting criteria and also questions we were hoping that the collected objects would speak to. The link for this will be provided in the chat, but I'm just going to go through some of the highlights now. So our key community collecting themes were protests, looking at public space and how it was used, infrastructure for the public, so definitely things like transit, our frontline workers. We were interested to see how New Yorkers were adapting during this time, both in home and out in the public. We also were looking at leisure and creativity, like what were some of the, the remarkable sort of unexpected outcomes that were coming out of this, how people were keeping themselves sane as well as what they were doing to simply get by. And then of course, there was no way to consider the pandemic without absence and loss. The questions we were hoping that these items would speak to included, how are these events changing the city now, and what direction might it take in the long term? How are some of the city's key industries affected, including real estate, tourism, retail and hospitality, performing arts and culture? How are different neighborhoods and populations experiencing these events? And this is, an important one because I'm sure you're all seeing too that the effects of the pandemic are playing out disproportionately among different neighborhoods, dependent on economics in your community. And I think that's a real challenge to try to figure out the best way to reach people in those communities too during this time. How is the current situation challenging existing ideas about city living? I know New York is seeing a number of people fleeing for the suburbs and other smaller cities. How are individuals coping and responding? And how is this moment affecting New Yorkers thinking about law enforcement and other areas of government and authority? So what was unique here for us in this particular situation is that these collecting goals and the questions were directly informed and influenced by the review of the photos we were receiving through the Instagram campaign. I'm sure we're all used to being able to get out when there are significant events in our cities and see with our own eyes what is happening across the city. And, it was definitely a challenging time to be able to do this as someone dedicated to preserving history. So in the review of these, we were looking for consistent themes. We were also wondering, what is it that we still aren't seeing here? We also began to launch direct outreach to organizations and businesses that were supporting the response and otherwise affected. And I have to say that the conversations we were having with a number of journalists who were covering our collecting efforts helped put us in touch with those people because they were likewise writing stories about them. And it was a really, really wonderful partnership we had with one journalist in particular. Also, like Ellie mentioned, we were trying to be sensitive to the demands of those who were actively responding to the crisis. So a lot of our outreach, we just kind of put on hold. I sent an email to people letting them know I was interested, but also very much like, when you have time to come back and talk to me, let's talk. And I think as we started to engage in the direct outreach, something that came up that I think is something that we all experience when collecting around a crisis moment is the emotionality. I found that I was interacting with so few people during the shutdown. I'd get on the phone with someone whose business was working and responding, and we would just end up having a great conversation about how each of us were dealing with things. And you make these connections to people you wouldn't have normally made, and then having to separate yourself from that and think about the actual objects that they have that they're suggesting and whether those still fit the mission of your organization. And it's a real challenge in times like this. And I know that, similar things, such as September 11th, you feel very emotional and people want to document it because it's such an impactful moment, and it's setting boundaries on yourself and what you bring in that can really support your collection in a meaningful way. So I just wanted to end by sharing some of the materials that we've brought in thus far. On the upper right-hand corner, we have a face mask that was invokes a hot dog. One of the things we were seeking to document through our collecting is major events in the city that were canceled. Every year, Coney Island, which is a big amusement park on the beach, a really great vibrant neighborhood, has what they call a Mermaid Day parade, where people dress up in all sorts of fantastic costumes, some of them mermaids, some other things. It's just a wonderful summer activity that's been going on for years. It was obviously canceled, so they held a virtual mask contest instead. This woman, Susie Sims Fletcher, won Best in Show. The hot dog is an iconic food of Coney Island, and so not only was it's an adorable mask, it also invoked a key theme of that area. We have been working with the New York Department of Parks and Recreation and acquiring a lot of signage about what they've been doing to make the parks safe during this time. And one of the things they also produced was this beach towel that's 6 feet long. It looks just like the signs they've put up throughout city parks. So when you're standing on the beach holding your beach towel that says keep this far apart, you know that you are maintaining social distancing. And then over on the far left, this marker here, it looks quite familiar to people who live in the US. These sorts of style of historical markers are found all throughout the country. Usually they, note that someone like George Washington or another founding father spent a night in a historical structure, or there was an important battle or something of that note. This artist, Norb Magnuson, for several years has been creating markers that speak to social and political questions. And he created this after the killing of George Floyd, commenting on the ongoing racial equity movement. And what was great about this is he also allows street artists to create small paste up stickers of this marker, and they had been pasted all over the city, which was how I eventually found him and got to the original marker. But this is just a small selection of the things we've been bringing in, and still very much collecting is ongoing for us. And with that, I will turn it over to Margriet.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is so inspirational. And I think there's a lot of links between our talks. So I will start also with sharing my screen. If I can find my PowerPoint, let's see. Wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, there it is. Okay, yeah, Corona in the City, an online exhibition. We went in the Netherlands into this sort of intelligent lockdown, which allowed us to go outside and to do all kinds of things, sort of mild lockdown, you could say. There's a lot of discussion still about that. In mid-March. And then, so first of all, a couple of weeks, everybody in shock, the museum closed down. And then we decided we need to do something with the entire museum staff, collaborate on this digital project. We envisioned, let's do a big open call. We launched it on April 30th, together with all kinds of local broadcasting stations, local newspapers, and so forth. And we called on as many partner organizations as we could think of to help us to collect stories, images of COVID in Amsterdam. And this was turned into an online exhibition. 2 weeks later, on May 15th, we opened with already almost 1,000 contributions and several rooms also, like exhibition spaces. And right now we have over 75,000 visitors, unique visitors to the site. We did a weekly program like this, an online program where we showed we discussed new contributions, new submissions, and we also evaluated what was coming in and had discussions with the audience. So what was coming in? Well, a lot of course, photographs and diaries on the new social distancing policies and what this meant for public space, the new markers that we encountered in public space. also very touching stories from people that worked in the hospitals, on the ICs. And this hit the news majorly also in the Netherlands. So the whole exhibition actually, but also particularly these images made by a nurse in one of the Amsterdam hospitals on the IC, went national. It really took a big, it had a major impact in the Netherlands. But also fantastic small stories on people that actually enjoyed also being more into their own neighborhoods and start to talk more with their neighbors, and especially also in the more poorer communities. Amazing stories that were shared. But most of all, what we got, hundreds and hundreds of photographs of empty streets in Amsterdam, because of course, normally this is not possible. Our streets look like this because we receive in Amsterdam over 18 million tourists on a population of 800,000 people. And this is becoming growingly a big problem. And for the last 2 years, this has been the cause of many, many discussions, how we can change this a bit, how we can create a different kind of environment also for the people that live in Amsterdam. And so this was, of course, something that was treasured, but also, it became also nasty, ugly discussions on that were very nostalgic, you could say. All of that happened also on our platform. And then it was mentioned before, another major discussion on June 1st, when the museums got to reopen in the Netherlands and the restaurants also. And that same day, the streets were flooded. And here you see Dam Square, which is like the core square in Amsterdam, with Black Lives Matter. And it meant a major discussion about the functioning of our mayor, but also major input on our platform. Many of the activists involved in the organization of Black Lives Matter already collaborate with the museum and many of our partners. So it was logical that we would become a hub also for these contributions. Up to this day, again, we are since yesterday in another intelligent lockdown, and our museum is closed. All the museums are closed. And libraries also, everything is slowing down, and we are still receiving many contributions and also beautiful new virtual rooms and exhibition spaces. What we see now in these later contributions is also, we worked a lot with different organizations, but also storytellers and makers from the different areas in Amsterdam. We paid them to start listening to their neighborhoods and come up with stories from people that do not respond to an open call, that do not have the space in their mind because of the social inequity that is, of course, a major thing in our city as well. And especially these kind of slow stories, softer stories that are normally not heard from people that do not speak up are now being contributed. So that's quite, I think, a very interesting contribution. For us to frame and to finish this story up, for us, the Amsterdam Museum is a city museum, which we call ourselves a network museum. We do everything together. We say we have several locations in the city center, but we also collaborate with a lot of museum space and public libraries and community houses throughout the city. We work a lot on co-creation projects like this, for instance, the Women of the New West. The New West is one of the biggest, but also one of the poorest areas in Amsterdam. And so this is a project about collecting new stories, new faces, new group portraits, and working together with different communities, often also traveling photography exhibitions throughout the city. And it rhymes with our core of historical objects and wonderful collection of almost 100,000 objects that depict a large part of the powers that be, the elite communities in the 17th century up to now. What we also do is often work with contemporary makers to give a different perspective on this on these historic collections, like this project with Jurgen Chonafong, an urban maker, theater maker, curator, making portraits of people of color that also lived in Amsterdam in the 17th, 18th century, based on historical research, but did not get their group portraits. And we combine these new and these old forms of collection. We also really make a strong mark in the decolonizing debate in the Netherlands in museum area, but also beyond that by also trying to become very aware of invisible thresholds, like a term like golden age for the 17th century, which is often used to glorify in a way this period. And we said we don't want to use it anymore as a synonym for the 17th century. We're going to use it only as 17th century because golden age, it was not for everybody. If you have roots in the colonies and for your ancestors, it was not a glorious period, and so not a golden age. So we see Corona and the city very much part of this movement of decolonizing museum collections and museum practices. And for us, it was also something to think about: how can we bring this digital to a more offline version, like for instance, in these photography exhibitions that we do alongside our buildings. But also it's a kickstart of a new big collective collecting project, Collecting the City it's called, and it's running up to the 750th anniversary of Amsterdam in 2025. And what we hope to do is that we cover all different areas in Amsterdam and gonna collect stories and objects together with a lot of the partners that we work with in Corona in the city. So yeah, I hope then that by then COVID is something of a past and is part of our museum installation instead of our reality. But right now it has been, in a way, for us, a big learning curve, a steep learning curve in how to do a rapid response collecting. And yeah, it's sad that this was the cause of that, but it has meant a great inspiration and a new way of working within our museums. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Margriet. I will share my screen now and hopefully cover some ground too, but the work that we've been doing in the Museum of London. So most of what the story I'm going to be telling you has been covered already by the speakers. So what I will do is to run through very quickly my slides and leave some time for questions. I've been checking the Q&A section of the Zoom link, and there are some really interesting questions over there. Just make sure that you move your questions over there so we can pick them up during the Q&A session at the end. So at the Museum of London, we start collecting, start thinking about collecting really towards the beginning of April, and we launched a big sort of collecting project that had a number of strands and included a public call out, some traditional museum initiated collecting, and community-led participatory approach to collecting. This was a mastodontic team effort, and some speakers have already recalled how the quick change in organizational structure required us to move to step up our game, really, in the midst of also us as people experiencing the pandemic. I am part of a small part of a big team of individuals, both within curatorial and within the whole organization that are delivering this project. Beatrice Belen is our project lead curators, and myself and Fettini Arvani are the two lead curators of other streams of collection. So what I would like to talk you through quickly is what the sort of objects that we received offered as part of the public call out, which were all amazing suggestions that many that reflected the sort of the clap from the NHS campaigns that was shared in March, in April during lockdown. Plenty of face masks, and also some lockdown Easter eggs that were a feature, together with lots of poetries too. Some museum-initiated collecting, included the will to record a number of ephemeras and material culture that was produced by artists and practitioners to reflect upon lockdown. And these include posters such as the Hodman poster that were introducing a satirical twist on migrants in the UK, and the fact that the lower scale migrants are actually heavily contributing to NHS and frontline working. Darren Cullen, who is best known for the Museum of Neoliberalism, also produced some satirical poster reflecting on the lack of PPE for key NHS workers. Like Margriet was referencing, we also had a flurry of suggestions about empty photographs of London streets, the photographs of empty London streets, but we also initiated a collecting in this respect. So we went out and collaborated with artists to record the empty soundscapes right where the first recordings that are held in the collection of the museum were done in 1928. And we also commissioned a Cyprus courier to do a GoPro recording on the empty London streets. A parallel project which is still happening and managed by my colleague, digital curator Feteni Albani, is the Going Viral project, where quite literally is looking into collecting the tweets that went viral during this period. A number of other museum-initiated collecting projects includes a hand sanitizer, which was made by a gin distillery, and a number of posters that were hung in the supermarkets chain Morrison to reflect on the spiraling domestic abuse and sexual violence during lockdown. A large part of our museum-initiated collecting also concerned photographs by better and less known photographers, such as the Spencer Murphy series on coronavirus in the city. We were also very cautious that in light of the rates of mortality that particularly affected people of color during the pandemic, that we wanted our material culture and oral history collection to reflect this. So we've been collaborating with the Jubilee Initiative, which you might be aware in the UK has written an open letter to the Prime Minister to ask for a public inquiry about the death of BME, of the disproportionate effect of the pandemic on people of color. We also collected this really huge billboard that the Jubilee Initiative, that an artist has created to support the Jubilee Initiative and provide fund for bereavement to BME, to the BME communities, and also a number of posters celebrating the Windrush generation. We commissioned some oral histories to BME NHS nurse to also kind of talk us through the direct experience of lockdown and what their the daily life of an NHS nurse was at the height of the pandemic. As many other museums, we also engaged very prominently with the Black Lives Matter movement. We are in the process of collecting and acquiring the I Can Breathe poster that reflected on George Floyd's last words, and that artist Greg Burney had produced. We're also in the process of working with the Black Cultural Archive to potentially collect some placards from the demonstration that took place around London. And that little statue on the right corner is what the statue of Robert Milligan that uncomfortably sat in front of the Museum of London Docklands looked like until the 9th of June 2020, when the Tower Hamlets Council in East London decided to remove the statue, responding to the increasing ask of activists and to remove statues and effigies of the empire, and following the topping of the Colston statue in Bristol. Some community-led featured collecting that we developed were particularly reflecting on the inability of the Muslim community, for example, to celebrate Ramadan during lockdown, which falls in Britain between the end of April and end of May 2020. We run 3 projects. One project which is where we work with 6 young women in West London, and we recorded their experience of Ramadan in lockdown via a WhatsApp chat that we are in the process of collecting in its entirety. We also worked with 7 families, Muslim families across London, to record their experience of celebrating Ramadan during lockdown, and also audio recorded the Adhan prayers that were exceptionally allowed to be publicly displayed in a mosque in East London. We were also very keen, as also Margriet and other speakers reflect upon, to look at the surge in supports and support networks across the city, mostly responding to lack of governmental support in the poorest areas of the city. So we have recorded a number of oral histories with mutual aid support networks, such as Project Parker, which is the north of the city, has been setting up an homeless shelter. We're also looking into collecting a tent that has been used for that purpose. We also have been recording the stories of a network that was developed to provide support to the elderly Rastafari in South London, and also a Filipino restaurant that cooked for NHS Filipino nurses. We also developed a range of academic partnerships and have got other projects in the pipeline, namely the Pandemic Streets project was developed in collaboration with UCL and Imperial College London to reflect upon the changes affecting social distancing during the city. So the students have actively researched the topic, and as part of this process, we are considering a number of acquisitions coming out. The few other we are obviously, this is an ongoing project, but 2 of the other community-led initiatives that are very close to my heart right now are reflecting on the inability of having big celebration and parades during the lockdown. And we are talking to Amnesty International, Black Pride, Para Pride, and Gender Intelligence to select digital content for their online programming of Pride 2021. As well as we're also working with refugee support networks to record the experience of unaccompanied minors during this time of crisis. So it's been a really huge organizational effort, and there is no question that some of the issues that we've been discussed are shared across the board from the museum all over. What I will be doing right now is to go through the Q&A list and pick up some questions. I do have to apologize in advance because I'm sure that we're not going to have all the time to answer to all the questions. But as I pick some, I would ask the panelists in no particular order to just jump in and give the answer. I previously saw a question about disability narratives, and that was circulated in the chat, which is important by and of itself, but also remind us of the fact that archives are never complete, and we need to strive for representation at all time. And I was wondering if any of your museums have thought about how to represent such important experience during lockdown, and if you've got any plans in this respect.
Yeah, I could say something about that, because we've been talking a lot to different communities in collaborating already in advance previous years to open up the museum. And of course, these were networks that were already there. So now during COVID, we already reached out to them, but it grew and grew and grew. So we are now working, if it's like all kinds of people with several disabilities have their own communities, and they all want to contribute to this platform to show how they've been coping. And I think that's been very interesting, because it also teaches us how to, in the future, start collaborating more with these networks. So it is something that is definitely high on our agenda.
I can speak about an object that has come our way through the community collecting initiative. We had a man who sent us in the notes that he created in order to take his husband, who was already health compromised prior to COVID, to the doctor, and it's step-by-step instructions of what he does to take him to his regular check-ins for the condition that he has, including the preparation of all of the equipment that they need to get him to the doctor, the preparation of all of their clothing, a change of clothing for once they get out of the taxi cab, different gloves. I mean, it's 2 pages of notes, and it's incredibly impactful, thinking that, you know, to a certain extent, they were going through this same routine without the same sort of contagion precautions in place for so many years, and it took COVID to sort of bring it to the highlight of, you know, of visibility. And there's so many remarkable stories like this that I think this situation is bringing to light.
Yeah, if I could just add that this is something that the museum's kind of growing. We've got to admit that actually in the past the museum has not always done the best job at representing people with disabilities and disabled people's experiences, and so this is something we just have to tackle head on and build and grow credibility and trust. Exactly the same as when we're collecting experiences of Black people, people of ethnic minorities who've been so disproportionately affected by this pandemic. I think we just have to be realistic, start small, follow all the advice that we know, start small, keep growing, let it grow, build that work in, and just let that happen. I think there's brilliant work being led at the Welcome collection in London that have really centred shielding and disabled people's experiences during the pandemic. They've looked around, I think, and given a lot of attention to that particular experience. So we'll be learning from them, working with disabled artists and groups in the future, but it's something which we do need to develop. It's a great question, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions, and thank you for your answers. At the Museum of London, we are at the moment looking into how we can complement the rapidity of the collecting, because that's I would like us to go back pretty quickly a bit on this notions of rapid response collecting, because it's I think it kind of is a double-edged sword in a way, because it pushes you into a quick response without necessarily having the time and space for reflection. And there is quite a lot of questions that have been asked in the chat about where do you find the space for reflection, and particularly I would link to questions of self-care, which are particularly important. So I was wondering if Ellie, you started us up thinking about self-care as well, and thinking about the fact that we are not immune. I wonder if do you have any reflections to do to make in relation to the rapidity of collection, and also a space for yourself to go.
Oh, well, sure, thank you. I think really the lesson I think to take from that is that none of us are separate from the times we live in. I think often as museum staff, we other people in our collecting, and that I think comes from a history of collecting that goes along with museums marginalising people and cultures. And I think the history of contemporary collecting and the systems we inherit are, you know, it's a legacy of harm and disempowerment for a lot of people. And so my lesson, I think, going through this is to have a great deal more thought and compassion about how we hold space to record memories and lived experience. And so that's, I think, what's been useful. also childcare. Had no childcare for a few weeks, and that was a pragmatically, realistically, very difficult challenge. But you know, lots of people go through worse. Lots of people are going through a great deal, and I think it's just taught me, and you know, thinking about my friends and loved ones, especially that group who are key workers, and you know, doing incredible work. It's just a time, I think, to turn that and learn from that, and say, actually, we have to be people before organisations. When we're collecting and working with people, you can. There's lots we need to do to hold power to account, to collect the material evidence of what's happening and how people have been cared for or not cared for by their employers. And you know, the experience that we've had as museum employees, especially museum employees like me, who are privileged enough to be working safe at home, I think is just something to reflect on and think about when we collect with other people about their lives. So I think that's what I'd say to that. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's got something off my chest, which is self-care too. So thank you.
Really, and please, if the other panelists have got something else to add, please feel free. I'm also conscious that we got 5 minutes until the end of the panel, and I would like to quickly also ask another question. But Margriet and Lindsay, do you have anything to add to the previous one?
Well, of course, our museum has not been involved yet into materializing our collection or adding on an analog way with objects. And although we want in the future to do that, but now it's only digital images and stories and so forth. And it brought about a big discussion in our museum also about stories as immaterial heritage in relation to material heritage, and how important it is if we only collect a story that's a digital asset, and also a photograph, it's a digital asset. How does it relate to a material one, and how we're going to continue with that? So we are in process of discussing that, changing that also, as we have a city archive that is doing these kind of things normally, and we are supposed to do only objects. So and yeah, so this is a big discussion. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering how Lindsay, for instance, would, because I know that in the New York City Museum they are much more further, I think, in that discussion.
Yeah, we are bringing objects in now at this point, for sure. And, you know, in terms of self-care with this, a lot of, we have very detailed health and safety plans for the museum, for staff and for visitors. And a big chunk of collection staff is going in on a regular basis now. I usually am going in physically at this point. But we continue to let staff really speak to what they feel comfortable with in terms of the risks they have to put themselves, transporting objects, receiving objects, you know, and I think we all are also very mindful, like Ellie has mentioned, that not everybody has that choice. We, you know, our security guards, our visitor services staff, they are in every single day. And so trying to be understanding of what the, you know, the staff within the museum is going through as a whole, as well as just across our entire city. And it's definitely one of the elements we're hoping to be able to document through this collecting initiative is that everyone had different experiences during the pandemic, and the term essential was defined many different ways, and sometimes that was essential to life, and sometimes that was essential to the convenience of others. And it's you know, it's a very upsetting topic to look at directly, but one I think that we all have to, as institutions that are documenting this time in the world's history, because I don't think the world will ever be the same. And I think we want to make sure it's for the better when we come out on the other side of it.
Precisely. Thank you, Lindsay and Margriet and Ellie for so eloquently having discussed this. Just to say, also we at the Museum of London are coming up against a very similar challenge, particularly with bringing back objects to the museum, of accessioning objects to the museum. As you might know, in the UK, we're going through another wave of lockdown, which meant that the van run that we had arranged with with some of our amazing colleagues to pick up objects all around the city had to be stopped. So so I think that there was also a number of questions in the chat to do with the more sort of organizational challenges of working practices in museum. And I am aware that we didn't have time to discuss those, but I just, because we've got 1 minute left, I just want to thank everybody for making some time in such a busy period and very emotionally charged period where we are home and with our own personal and individual circumstances. We not just have to juggle work, but also a great deal of emotional labor. So I just want to thank all the speakers for making time, to the Museum Association, to everybody attending this. And Tamsin, I don't know if you want to come back.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the speakers and all of our audiences. The recording will be available so you can dip in and hear this rich experience at a later date. That'll be on the MA website in the next week or so. The next session is at 4 o'clock, and the practice session is managing social history collections in a digital age. So there's some resonance in terms of the Twitter collection. Thank you very much, and I'll say goodbye. See you all soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.